Day students, this is Mrs. Delgado, and we are going to be continuing with our section on the French and Indian War, which will later lead into our section on the American Revolution. The last I left you in the previous recording, we had gone over the differences in comparing and contrasting sides between the French and the British. So we're going to go ahead and move into this map, which is a representation of the war all across the world. Now we know that in the United States, we refer to it today as the French and Indian War. And the reason why we refer to it as the French and Indian War is because we recognize the alliance between the French and the Indians and how at the time the colonists were under British control. So it was ultimately the British colonists against the French, but also England against France. And that's why we call it the French and Indian War, is just acknowledging that alliance between the French and the Native Americans. On this map, the blue represents Great Britain, Prussia, which we know today as Germany, Portugal, along with its allies. The green represents France, Spain, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and its allies. You can see the parts where the wars or battles had taken place all across the world, and not just in the United States or Canada, but again, that's where we will be focusing on for the remainder of this section as well as the first section. Because it took place in many parts of the world or in different parts of the world, it was known as the first real World War. Let's take it into the early battles. The French in the early years of the French and Indian War will see many major victories, and the French capture the British forts at Lake Ontario and Lake George, and I'll show you a map and where they're located today. But they were able to capture those forts, which today are in upstate New York as well as on the Canadian border. And that's where they meet, the French and Indians, along with the British. And that's the territory that they're largely going to fight over. Now, what happens is France's Native American allies, so their Indian allies, raid farms from the New York and Virginia frontiers. And I'll show you what that looks like in a map. And when they start to invade these New York and Virginia frontiers, they begin to harass the British colonists. Now, remember, colonists at that time were people that were sent over by their mother countries, whether it be from Spain or France or England, and they're sending these people over to the New World so that they can be represented and they can establish themselves or trade and make settlement. But by and large, they are there to live and represent that country, and they're still under the control of that country. So they're still following British laws or French laws, but just in a different part of the world. Let's go ahead and take a look at this map. This is a present day map of New York and a portion of Canada. You can see that Lake George is here, located in New York, and then we have Lake Ontario here, that on this side of Lake Ontario, it borders New York, and on this side of Lake Ontario, it borders Canada. Now imagine during that time of the French and Indian War, there were British forts that were set up as well as French forts, and there were British forts over here, but the French went and started taking over these forts and started harassing the colonists and then moving them further east. Moving on to the next slide. Again, just to reiterate and show you, so we have the British colonists here. However, the French are going and infiltrating and taking over those forts, and we saw that with Lake George, and they are forcing the British colonists in this area called the Virginia frontier, since it's so close to the west, they're forcing these people to move farther to the east coast. So they're going and harassing these settlers here, trying to fight over that land, and very successfully pushing them further east so that they're able to take over that territory. This picture is a representation of the French and Indian ambush on the British soldiers, and they are actually pushing them out, and the British are retreating, and this is in Fort Duquesne, which is in modern day Pittsburgh. Now we're going to move on to the earlier battles. As I had mentioned before, the French and its allies, its Native American allies, really dominate the first 3 years of the war. And we're going to talk a bit about Fort Oswego in 1756, Fort William Henry in 1757, and Ticonderoga in 1759. Now, in Fort Oswego, what happens is the French see a very, very successful victory. They are able to capture and kill up to 1,700 British soldiers. Again, a huge defeat. They're able also to capture over 100 cannons, about 121. So not just taking their men, but also taking their supplies, their weapons. And in 1757, they also see success with the capturing of Fort William Henry. And in Fort William Henry, they have over 2,000 Native Americans on their side. And the British are not they're not naive. They know that they're about to lose this battle. And so they pretty much surrender. However, they tell the French, we'll surrender Fort William Henry. However, before we surrender, we're going to make a bit of a deal. And this deal is we know that there's over 2,000 Native Americans, and we're going to possibly be attacked because they don't like us. They know that they're not liked because of their establishments. So they ask the French for their protection as they leave Fort William Henry. They say, protect us from these Native Americans, ensure that they're not hurting us or hurting our people, and we'll surrender. Well, the French agree, and the British are heading out of Fort William Henry. But as they are heading out of Fort William Henry, well, the Native Americans, they breach that agreement, they violate it, and they start attacking the British colonists. Now, at this time, there's British settlement, so not only are they attacking the British soldiers, but they're attacking women, children, the sickly, the elderly, and so it becomes a huge massacre. And as you can imagine, the British government, all the way in England, they are definitely not happy with this, as well as the British who are already established in the New World. So now it becomes a really, really unsettling war for the British. And it's in 1759 in Ticonderoga where the tables begin to turn. The British have about 11,000 men. And Ticonderoga today is located in New York. But they capture this French fort. And when they capture this French fort, the French know that they have been successful over the past 3 years. So this is really something that is not sitting very well with them. They don't want to lose to the British. So what they do is they would rather blow up their own fort rather than have the British capture it. So they take a bunch of gunpowder and they try to blow up their own fort. And they were very successful, except for the fact that the walls still stood. Well, the British, of course, took advantage of this and they took over the fort anyways, even though it was largely blown up. Now, this is a picture of Fort Oswego, and you can see the French flag right there. Oh, of course, that's a representation of the fact that the French had a huge victory in Fort Oswego. Moving on to the next slide. Enter Sir William Pitt. Sir William Pitt is actually a British foreign minister. And this, like I mentioned, is a turning point for the British in 1758. He is the British foreign minister, and what he does is he really supports the war. He gives the means for the war, he gives them a lot of money, he gives them supplies, and he really plays it smart. He begins to form these Native American allies because they know the land. They've been helping the French a lot. The French have been incredibly successful up until this point, and he begins to adopt Indian fighting strategies. So when all of these things are implemented, are able to see several victories. In September of 1759, with British General James Wolfe, they lead a surprise attack on Quebec, which is in Canada, and they find successful that, which is a major win for them in Canada. The British also find victory at Fort Niagara and cut off the French frontier forts, which ultimately sees England to winning the entirety of the war. Even though they saw some unsuccessful battles at the beginning, it ends in much success. This painting is a representation of James Wolfe dying, and this is during the surprise attack battle on Quebec. The 1763 Treaty of Paris is ultimately what ends the entire war. Now, there are dozens of treaties of Parises, but the one that ends the French and Indian War is the 1763 treaty. France lost the Canadian colonies and the claims to the land east of the Mississippi River. Now, here's the Mississippi River right here. So they lose all of their territories east of the Mississippi River, and that belongs to the British after the French and Indian War. England got all of the French territory in Canada, in Florida, and rights to the Caribbean slave trade. This line right here, this dotted line that goes from Maine all the way down here to Georgia, that is actually called the Proclamation Line of 1763, and it separated the British colonies from the French colonies at the time. Spain got French territory, and this was the French territory west of the Mississippi River. As I had mentioned before, this is the Mississippi River. This is the land French west of the Mississippi River, which went from the French to Spanish colonization. These are the pre-war boundaries, 1754. So this was the land, this striped orange and pink section right here. This is the land that was being fought between the British and the French. This is post-war boundaries. This is after the war. As you can see, the British gained control over that land. And this is the Proclamation Line of 1763. Now, the effects of the war. This is a painting of Chief Pontiac. Now, we talk so much about the French and the British, or really the Native Americans were tremendous help to the French during that time and eventually would become tremendous help to the British. The question is, what type of territory or what type of benefits did they get from this war? And the answer is pretty much nothing, and they were very much aware of that. So Chief Pontiac forms a Native American alliance with several other Native American tribes, the Miami, the Shawnee, the Iroquois, and several others, and they start to fight back and push back against the British. Now, of course, they couldn't really step up to the British in the way that they would like to, considering the types of resources that the British had. They had guns and cannons, and the Indians really, one of their main benefits was just knowing their way around the land. So ultimately, they couldn't measure up to the British, and of course, they lost that war, which Pontiac's War ended in 1765. England, however, issued the Proclamation of 1763 that would prevent the colonists from further moving westward. Now, this is coming all the way from England, and they are telling their British colonists in the New World, don't move further west. There are Native American tribes there, and what's happening is they're getting really upset, and this is causing a friction between the Native Americans and the British, and it's just really causing more battles that they don't want to take part in, especially since they had just finished up with the war with the French. What else angers the colonists is not only trying to prevent them from moving westward, which they think is cheap land because it's uncharted territory, it's good farmland, but what the British begin to do is they start to tax the colonists. And the reason why they tax the colonists, and they're only taxing the colonists that live in the New World, is because they need to pay this war back. They've lost so many lives, they've lost so many resources, and therefore these taxes are supposed to repay these losses. And so this causes a friction between the colonies and the actual motherland of Great Britain, which is eventually going to lead to the American Revolution, or one of the main causes of the American Revolution. Now, this is an exit ticket that we don't really have time for, or we would have gone over in class. You can just take a look. It's only 3 items, and try to think of what would be your answers, and we can discuss this as we meet on Tuesday. I will meet you next week, Tuesday, and we will meet during your designated period's time, and I will post right before we meet. So have a good rest of your week.